After their opening statements, we will start the question and answer period of time. We want everyone to know that the League is a nonpartisan organization, and we do invite all of the legislators of either party to participate in this discussion, as far as the legislators that represent Brown, Monroe, and Johnson counties. So they have all been invited, and Shelley and Matt have taken us up on that invitation this morning. Remember that this is an informative session. We are not debating, and we would like for everyone to be civil and respectful. And I will say, in all of the forums I've participated in so far, everyone has been remarkable in observing those requests. The legislators will have 3 to 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will start the questions, and we will rotate back and forth as to who answers the question first. After the legislators' remarks, then the questioning sessions will begin. As I said, send your question to One Question Moderator. You will be asked to unmute your question or unmute your speaker when it comes time for you to ask your question. If time permits, second questions will be permitted. Please be concise. Time will be moderated. All legislators will be given the opportunity to respond to each and every question. This session is being recorded by the CATS system, the Community Access Television Services. So be sure that you are aware of that, and it will be available for viewing at a later point in time. I think that's all the ground rules that we need to lay out for everyone at this point in time. So I will call upon Matt to first give your opening statements.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And it's hard to believe it's that time of year again, with the legislature getting ready to start in I guess about a month. So this is our long session budget year. So I think that will dominate a lot of the discussion. And unlike the previous budget cycles, last couple of budget cycles, the budget, at least indications are, it's going to be very tight. So I think that there are going to be more difficult decisions being made in this budget round. And obviously, the two major things in the budget are education and healthcare, basically Medicaid. And so one of the discussions I think needs to be had is, you might know that in previous sessions, the legislature made private school vouchers essentially universal. They've got a little bit of the wealthier people left to get to, which the governor wants the legislature to go ahead and make it just open to everyone. And so right now we're at about $500 million of money that could be going to our public schools, instead are going to the voucher program. And so I think we're going to have a discussion about, if money's tight, what are our priorities? Are we going to make sure that our public schools, first and foremost, have the resources they need to do the job, because they have to serve every child no matter what? Or do we continue to send hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to private schools that basically get to pick and choose who they take? And then on Medicaid, we've already seen some changes that FSSA has made to programs for senior citizens for care, and the disabled that have not been very good, people with very complex medical conditions. And so I think that's going to be another big debate, is how do you deal with the cost of Medicaid? And quite honestly, I'm just kind of concerned that we're going to come out of this session with just a lot of people getting hurt. Everyone will brag about the balanced budget, which is required by the Constitution. So I'm not saying we should deficit spend, but the point is the priorities we choose for how we spend what money we have. I'm concerned that everyone is just going to be focused on the bottom line and not really thinking about how the budget impacts the actual, people who rely upon the services of the state. The other interesting thing is at Organization Day, the speaker normally lays out the majority party's agenda for the upcoming session. And he essentially admitted that he wasn't really going to do that on Organization Day. He had very little to say about issues. And he made an allusion to the fact that we have a new governor coming in. So I don't know if that means the House Republican majority is going to defer to the governor's agenda. I kind of doubt it, but I think that will have an influence on some of the issues that get considered. And you can find out there online the governor's very extensive agenda, which has hundreds of points in it. And the only thing that kind of struck to me as I tried to absorb all of the things on his list is he wants to provide an awful lot of tax cuts and breaks for various different groups. And I'm trying to figure out how he's going to pay for all of that if we're already working on a tight budget. So I think that's going to be difficult. The one thing I think the governor is likely to be pushing for is he wants to protect the coal industry. The coal industry has been pushing very hard to prevent any coal plants in Indiana from being closed. And I think there's going to be an effort to try to put into law a moratorium that would prohibit utilities from closing coal plants. And you might recall that the governor sent a letter before the election to the Utility Commission asking them to deny a request to convert half of a coal plant from coal fired generation to natural gas generation, which is still a fossil fuel, but it's about 50% less carbon at the burning point. And so all indications are that the administration is going to be pushing pretty hard to protect coal. So that's a battle I'm kind of anticipating. And then finally, in the House, we have this thing called the bill pending rule, which means if you introduce a bill and it goes to committee and the committee chair refuses to give it a vote, you are not able to offer that same subject matter on the House floor as an amendment to another related bill. So because of that, when you're in a minority party, you really don't want to introduce a lot of bills. You want to leave options open to offer amendments on the floor. But I have introduced a plan on introducing two bills. One is my end of life options bill, which deals with people who are suffering from terminal illnesses, gives them the ability to choose a death with dignity that's already inevitable. And then finally, another bill, which the chair of the House Courts Committee asked me to put together, is one that would deal with this odd thing called signal jammers. There's a new thing where criminals are now getting these devices that basically block your Wi-Fi, your cell phones. And what that does is it blots out a lot of security cameras and keeps people from using their cell phones. And so that's already illegal under federal law. But now I think we need a state law to mirror that, because the truth is the Federal Communications Commission can't really enforce that across the entire country, and they got to get the Department of Justice involved. And that's just pretty cumbersome. So I want to give our local prosecutors and law enforcement some tools to work with to deal with that. So I'm working on that bill and hope to get it in good enough shape to introduce.
Matt, thank you very much for those opening remarks. Shelley, let's turn to you and have your perspective.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you, Representative Pierce, for your opening remarks and providing such a great overview of where we are starting this legislative session. From the Senate side, it's been a little quiet in terms of some of the supermajority's priorities, but some things that we do know they will be working on will be property taxes and, excuse me, property taxes and, of course, Medicaid expenses. I agree with Representative Pierce in his concerns about, at the end of the day, who's going to be hurt by these cuts to Medicaid. And I've been very intentional as I've met with constituents and been working on legislation to file and what to prioritize this session. I have been prioritizing, one of the buckets I've been prioritizing is how do we improve healthcare outcomes, as well as doing so to reduce Medicaid expenses. And in focusing in that area and in meeting with so many of you who care about these issues and work in this space and have spent your life's work in this area, I'm working on a bill that would create a nurse visitation program for every new parent in the state of Indiana. We currently have the Nurse Family Partnership Program, which has seen incredible outcomes for new moms and new babies. But that program has very clear guardrails on who can participate in that program. And it's had good outcomes. So I've been researching how can we expand it to include more people. And the state of Oregon put together, it's called Family Connects, and it provides a home visit from a nurse to any parent, regardless of income, in that first year to come to the house and be available, do a home visit. And the state of Oregon has seen a substantial decrease on visits to the emergency room, and it has lowered their Medicaid expenses. And it has also improved maternal and infant health outcomes in that first year. So I'm working on that bill. So I'm excited about filing that and hearing from you on ways that we can create such a program here in Indiana. I'll also be continuing to work on what Hoosiers have said loud and clear, that they want access to abortion care in that first trimester for all individuals. And so I will be reintroducing the repeal of the abortion ban in the state of Indiana once again, and working on advancing that with bipartisan support. I'll also be working on making over-the-counter birth control Medicaid covered for our Medicaid recipients. Currently, Indiana does not cover Medicaid over-the-counter birth control Medicaid coverage, and we could really save in Medicaid dollars by making that possible. And there is a waiver that the state of Indiana could apply for, and I will be filing that bill and have had some interest in having my Republican colleagues join me on that bill. So hopefully that will improve health outcomes and reduce Medicaid expenses, those two bills that I'm working on. The other one is what Matt said, Representative Pierce commented on. He said, we need to have the same amount of transparency and accountability. If we're going to blow the lid off of vouchers in the state of Indiana, we need to make sure that the consistency and transparency and accountability holds forth for every single K through 12 school in the state of Indiana if we're going to be funding it. So we'll be working on that legislation to make sure that we protect every Hoosier tax dollars when it comes to education. And of course, standing up to protect our traditional public schools. I am still on the education committee, thank goodness. There's been some changes in our committee appointments. I'll get to that in just a minute, but I am still on the education committee and will be fighting hard for our traditional public schools. And I was on the interim education committee. The legislature tried to address chronic absenteeism last session, and while I appreciate the efforts, we didn't get it right. That's a shock. And we needed to improve it. So I'm working on some legislation to fix that based on the recommendations of our interim committee and based on some work and conversations with ISTA and a very active group out of the School of Education at IU to improve and to address chronic absenteeism that is both, student friendly and teacher friendly. And I'm excited about that legislation as well. And finally, improving the economic vitality of our state. I have been working with some folks in our community on ways to really get at the poor income, the income ability. I can't even think right now. I'm traveling, so I'm sitting in a Holiday Inn meeting room right now. The low ability for people in Indiana to earn an income that they can actually support themselves and their families. And how do we get at this? So one area was the federal government actually passed a bipartisan bill in 2022 to encourage employee-owned businesses in our states, and basically co-ops. How do we make it easier for individuals to start co-ops? Because that does raise income levels. Indiana currently does not have any resources identified from a state-supported resource center to help businesses transition into being employee-owned or to start employee-owned businesses. And what the federal government did was they created a $500 million grant program to states to offer these resources within the states that have a state-sponsored resource center. Indiana does not currently have one. So I am working on legislation that would create Indiana's first state-supported, employee-owned resource center to get some of these resources to Hoosiers who want to start businesses with other Hoosiers and have it be shared resources on when the business does well, Hoosiers do well. And I see this as one way to respond to some of our crises that we have in the state of Indiana, from childcare to access to maternal health, being able to empower Hoosiers to address these in some of our small communities throughout Indiana and not so small communities. So that piece of legislation I'm excited about and will be filing as well. And things that I know that the League of Women Voters care about. I am working with the Indiana Forest Alliance to file a designated wild areas bill. And I'm also working with the School of Public Health on filing legislation on food is medicine in that work. And I will be filing a bill based on the Michigan model of it's a 10-cent per meal incentive for every state contract, whether it's in our schools or in our correctional facilities. Every state meal, if you first prioritize filling those contracts with food that's grown and sourced here in Indiana, you would get a 10-cent incentive. And so right now I'm working on that legislation and figuring out how I'm going to pay for it. So I'm working on some ideas to pay for that 10-cent incentive. It's improved health outcomes in the state of Michigan, as well as improved the economic success of farmers in Michigan. So I'm working on that as well and continuing to work on my tax credit for beginning farmers. So that's another piece of legislation I'm working on. I wanted to get back to some changes that I've seen in my own committee appointments. I will be on agriculture, education, and let's see here, ag, education, natural resources, health, ranking minority member of health. And that's a change from years prior. But I was taken off of appropriations, and I'm pretty upset about it. Here's why. I fought for 3 years to have a woman be a member of appropriations. Right now, the only woman on appropriations is Liz Brown. And I felt it was really important that our Democratic caucus have somebody who identifies differently in terms of gender on that committee. And I finally last year got a place on appropriations and was taken off of it this year. So it continues to be on the appropriations committee on the Senate side. There is one person on that does not identify as male, and it's Liz Brown out of Fort Wayne. And that is of deep concern to me. The place where we identify how we are going to reflect our values is our budget, and the fact that we only have, we lack representation on that committee is of real concern. And so I'm continuing to be a loud voice in that space, and I'm disappointed. We've had some real challenges. Real challenges in my caucus over the last 4 weeks, and we're probably, that space. I don't know if you've kept up with what's in the newspapers, but it's going to influence, I think, our effectiveness in the 2025 legislative session. But I want you to know that it only has motivated me to work that much harder for you, to make sure that you feel that you have representation at the State House and someone who you can reach out to and talk to, and make sure that I am working as hard as I can for you. So I really appreciate these opportunities to get in front of you and have these conversations. And this is the first of many that we're going to have together. So thank you. I'll be quiet now, and I'm excited to take your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for those great opening remarks to give us some perspective on this upcoming legislative session. We do have someone in the queue, Carrie Miksha, who will be asked to unmute her mic and ask her question. And the question will go first to Shelley. And I will ask everyone else, please get in line to ask your questions by contacting one question moderator. Thank you. Carrie, I'm sorry. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
That's all right. Hi, guys. Shelley and Matt, thank you so much for all that you do. This next session will, of course, be an adventure, as usual. I was curious about, as being a board member of the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, questions about the push for accountability. Is that legislation being written by Republicans? And has there been any discussion about adding caps to the school, the choice program, the largest voucher program? Because we have, 4 different vouchers right now in Indiana. If you count SGOs, we have SGOs, ESAs, CSAs, and then the choice scholarship program. The choice scholarship program is the largest, and was wondering if there would be any movement on just putting a cap on that program. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I will, whether or not to that question of asking if there's going to be a cap, you and I haven't talked about what that legislation might look like. We should meet. Just say that before answering it. I have not heard. I know that Senator Hunley will be So, and it's going to continue to be Senator Ford as ranking minority member. There was a change, but so many people, were very concerned about that it is Senator Ford, and we are working on this. I've not heard of what that language is going to look like. To be safe, I'd like to know what you want, because we have a deadline on the 12th that every piece of legislation that we want to file, we have to at least make that request to LSA. We don't have to have it perfect at this point, but we just at least have to make the request by the 12th. So if we could get that language at least introduced to LSA and then work it out, that would be ideal. I've not heard anything about education priorities, nothing. Yeah. I have met with ROTS. It is a complete mystery. I have asked, what do you think you will be prioritizing? And it is tight-lipped.
Right.
My concern is they took off of education the one true fighter for public education, and that is, and that this says something. It is Senator Leising.
Yeah,
they
I know.
took her off of the committee because she asks too many questions. She's the only person in our education committee on my Republican side who even has the courage to push back in committee.
Yeah, Darnell went too, right?
So those individuals have been taken off of the committee.
I know.
And she and I had a long conversation about this, and she said it is going to be those 4 Democrats who will be the only people asking the questions. It will be all on you, because they flat out told her, you ask too many questions and you make the committee meetings too long and too uncomfortable, for that matter. So
the
it won't be a Republican.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The accountability bill is Democrat led.
I am sure it will be.
Okay, yeah, it's not a popular topic, whereas caps, because there's caps already on ESAs and CSAs, they're going to expand those caps, but there's no cap on the choice scholarship program. There's just budget numbers. But sometimes you go past those numbers and they somehow, make it all work.
The only thing I'm hearing is that cap will be removed.
The caps for CSAs and ESAs?
Yes,
great.
On choice. that will no longer have the little cap that it has. I mean, it will just be removed. So I know that is most likely going to happen, although I've only heard it through hearsay. So I have not had a conversation. I've not heard what those priorities are going to be. I have heard that there is a desire to not hear many bills. I did hear that there was a desire in education to not hear many bills. I don't know what that means. They always say this, but I anticipate that we'll probably hear a few bills, and those bills will have significant impacts on public education.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Matt, would you like to address Carrie's question?
Yeah, I hate to be cynical or a downer, but here's the reality. These Republicans do not want a system of public education. They want to continue to move to universal vouchers, and eventually they want to get to the point where every single parent just gets a check in the mail and it says, here is your education money for your kid, go find some education. And the money will not even flow directly to the public schools. And then, they'll see if enough people with that money, I mean, maybe they'll say, oh, I'll keep this money in homeschool, that'll help me out with my bills. Maybe I'll do that. So there's pretty radical ideas out there. And if you look at what our incoming governor has said, because he's put out his list of priorities, he's got under empower families to select the best education for their children. And number one is direct the Secretary of Education to recommend strategies to increase supply of high quality school options in communities with low performing public schools. So what he's saying there is, let's create, instead of bolstering up and helping support public schools that have difficult populations to educate, instead of that, let's create more ways to have people siphon the money away and go other places. So in rural areas or places that they already have a charter school, let's get them one. Let's get some private schools going. Number two is extend universal school choice to all families. So they don't want to rein the program in or limit it. They want to expand it. And so I think that tells you exactly where things are going. And the Democratic caucus in the House, and I'm sure in the Senate for at least a decade now, every session tries to bring accountability and transparency to what's happening with our taxpayer dollars in these charter and private schools. And they're just not really interested. I mean, look, we had that, huge scandal and people getting arrested over virtual charter schools and all kinds of crazy stuff. And that not much really came out of that. So, we're going to try all that and we've also been making the point for years now that if you want to divert a bunch of money to private schools, you should not be doing it at the expense of the public schools. So until you have enough money to fully fund public schools and do the vouchers, you should not be continually expanding those programs. And again, total deaf ears. So I think the majority party is not going to be much interested in these kind of checks and balances we would like to get into the system.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Carrie, for those questions, and thank you for your responses. to both of our legislators. And we do have Kathy Roundtree in the queue. I do want to explain, I'm not trying to discourage discussion with these two legislators while we have them available, but our normal protocol is that you unmute, you ask your question, then you mute, and we allow each one to answer the questions. And then if you have a follow-up question, you can come back into the queue. And if we have time, we will allow you to have a second shot at each one of the legislators to ask any follow-up questions. So just kind of wanted to reiterate those ground rules. And with that having been said, Kathy Roundtree, would you like to pose your question? And the first one to answer will be Matt.
Hi, thank you. I just want to thank both of you for being here. For those of us whose representatives and senators don't come to these forums, we just appreciate having your perspective and having some kind of a voice. My question has to do with public health. Under Governor Holcomb, there was a big expansion both in the funding and the scope of services for county public health departments, which allowed county health departments to vastly improve the services they were offering. Most counties in the state accepted that money and changed their structure, changed their funding, and started offering these services. We are hearing that the incoming governor does not plan to continue funding for this. And I'm very concerned about the impact that will have on public health in Indiana and the chaos that I think would result from basically undoing everything that's been done over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Matt, would you like to respond first, please? You're muted, Matt.
Yeah, I'm multitasking here by trying to read through this voluminous governor's thing. So I'm trying to get to the health section to see what he has to say about that, to see if we can divine any clues from it. But I was saying that I think Shelley might have a little more insight on this because she's been kind of more involved directly with these committees. But I think it's true that the incoming governor probably does not have that same set of priorities, and the budget's going to be really tight. And they're going to be looking for ways to limit spending. That's going to make it an uphill battle in the first place. And I think that the incoming governor, is really focused on really not government things to deal with healthcare, but more just kind of shaping what happens in the workplace. And so when he was a member, he would get really frustrated because he didn't think that you needed the Affordable Care Act and a lot of these government initiatives to provide healthcare to people, because in his own business, he told me this story, and he thinks this is the magic solution, is he, as an employer with growing employees, he would go out and buy a kind of a standard health insurance policy, and the premiums kept going up and up and up, and it was kind of really eating those profits, and he's very frustrated by it. And somebody finally showed up at his doorstep and said, here's what you need to do. You need to self-insure, and you need to create a health program where you have high deductibles and copays so that your employees will be very careful about when they use healthcare, because they're going to pay like on the front end. And then you just buy yourself a big kind of catastrophic umbrella policy. So if one of your employees gets cancer, has a stroke or something, the catastrophic policy will pick that up. And that's the way you want to go. And he did that, and his costs went down, because essentially what happened is they got shifted more to the employees because they had higher copays and deductibles. And so I was trying to jump into this, into his list on this, because I think he talked about doing something like that. He's got some language. I mean, it's a little cryptic and hard to know exactly what this stuff is until you actually see a bill. But it looked like he was saying he wanted some kind of legislation that would encourage more employers to have these kind of individual health insurance policies. I think he's trying, his idea is to get some money in the hands of some employees and they go look for the insurance, something along those lines. And so again, it's a little bit unclear to me, but I think his focus is not going to be on how do you bolster public health or what government programs you have now that attempt to make sure people have health care. I think he's going to be more focused in on employer-based health care and how he feels that can be made more affordable for the employer.
Thank you, Matt, for those comments. Shelley, would you like to address that question?
Yes, I have not heard specifically. I've only heard from local health departments that are very concerned about this funding, the very thing that Kathy has mentioned. I've heard it from, many local health departments have reached out to me. I do know that the chair of health shares the priority of protecting that program and the funding. So I know that we're going to work hard to protect it and not see a decrease in the monies that go to our counties. I actually believe that by the end of 2024, every county had actually finally bought in to this program. When I think originally maybe it was 5 counties opted out, and slowly they've all opted in, and now we have I believe every county opted in. Maybe one isn't, but to hear that perhaps that funding is now going to go away and these health departments have convinced their counties it's the right thing to do, they feel betrayed. And what we need to be doing is making sure that that funding that was promised to them will continue because of the good work that our local health departments do. I know that even in Monroe County, our local health department has seen some real significant issues, particularly with our Futures Clinic. That was a staffing problem, and then it was a funding problem, and working out those issues. But our local health departments do such incredible good, from, of course, access to vaccinations, education, making sure our restaurants are doing what they need to do to keep us safe, but also our septic systems. They're responsible for making sure that our septic systems are working well and not dysfunctional. So the amount of work that our local health departments do, we just need to make sure that that money is protected. But I've not heard anything specific from the governor's office in terms of numbers. So we'll have to wait and see. But I have a good relationship with the ranking minority, the chair of the health committee, and I know that he is worried about this as well. So I'm glad that at least he shares that priority with me.
Thank you very much, Shelley. It appears that we don't have anyone in the queue right now, but your local leagues are always prepared for that eventuality. I would encourage everyone to be thinking about questions they might want to ask and direct them to One Question Moderator if you have one. But in the meantime, I will ask a question that our 3 leagues put our heads together to ask you. And this one will be directed first to Shelley. As a taxpayer, what has the Indiana Economic Development Corporation done for me? In other words, what is the role of the IEDC and how are its actions transparent and accountable?
Oh, that is just, thank you for that question. I see Representative Pierce laughing. He's like, I'm glad she got that one first. Yes, the IEDC was created as its own sort of nonprofit entity to do economic vitality projects and to attract new business to Indiana, to address some of these issues, because removing it from under the umbrella of the state, I think the idea was it would provide an opportunity for it to have, less transparency. I'm just going to put it out there. I think there were some things when you're working out these deals with businesses, you have to keep some of the what you're offering confidential, and the businesses who are looking to move here want to be, those names need to be kept confidential, and there were just some legal issues. So the IEDC was created, and yet it's funded. It's a huge line item in supporting the initiatives of the IEDC. And in this last couple of years, the large LEAP project that the IEDC is creating up in northwest of Indianapolis has created a lot of concern from residents of Indiana, saying we don't feel like we have any say in what's going on. There were plans to begin moving water around, because when they originally planned this LEAP district, they did not take into account the access to water to be able to do the infrastructure that is needed to attract these the business and the industry to that area. So kudos to Indiana residents who have organized, mobilized, and started to push back and demanded some transparency and accountability on the IEDC's part. And as a legislator, I feel that IEDC has kind of gone underground, even more so, not hearing a whole lot, because they know that they are sort of in the target, in the bullseye of many Hoosiers saying, we want accountability. We want to see what you're doing. We are tired of all the secrecy. I'm not saying that's just what Hoosiers are feeling, that they don't know what's happening with IEDC. And I'm not on the budget committee, which is it's different than appropriations. It's bipartisan. And I know that my caucus has been working very hard to bring about some transparency from IEDC and holding them accountable. But I have not seen or heard much from them. I think they work primarily with the supermajority, and we'll have to see what the new governor is going to do in terms of addressing the very bad reputation that IEDC has right now. I know I had mentioned the bill that I want to file, the state-supported employee-owned resource center, and placing that within the state. Some individuals have said, well, that seems like it should be placed in the IEDC. And I've been very clear that no, it should not be placed in the IEDC. This should be a resource center that is accountable and transparent to how the monies are being spent, and every Hoosier has access to it, that it isn't sort of this difficult or nebulous entity that has evolved into the IEDC. I think the IEDC can do good and does do good. It's just it's hard to know, because it's separate from, it's its own nonprofit entity. So I know that isn't helpful, but as a legislator, it's a little hard to know myself and to make sure that I understand and have access to all of that information as well, before we continue to just keep funding something that we don't know how those monies are spent.
Thank you, Shelley. I know that one came out of left field, but I think it's been on a lot of people's minds, as you can see. So Matt, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a bright spot for us, in that the governor does have the incoming governor, Braun, has some language in his proposals to talk about making IEDC more transparent and accountable. Now, the kind of bullet points underneath it don't seem super accountable and transparent to me. I mean, he's talking about, impacts when IEDC does something that might require new utilities. So if they broker a deal to site a new plant, or like this LEAP project, if you've got to bring a lot of electricity into that plant, people may not realize it, but those are basically paid for by the ratepayers. As a matter of fact, there's like special law that says that I can cut a deal to make the utility infrastructure cheap for the plant, and then I can build that into the rate base. So then all the ratepayers pay for like the new line that has to go to the manufacturing plant. And I think that's gotten some scrutiny lately about whether that makes sense in light of this LEAP district. And so I think that the IEDC will get perhaps some kind of change with the new administration. I don't know what it will amount to, but the whole point of the IEDC was to reduce transparency. Now, I don't think they would have said it would reduce accountability, but I think it basically has. But the whole argument, the frustration was that as the old economic development entity tried to deal with these corporations, we're basically playing one state off of another. So they'll come to Illinois and say, what do you give me if I do this? And then they'll go to Indiana. Well, Illinois is going to give me this. Can you match it? And all that back and forth. They didn't want that out in the open, all that negotiating. And they kept bumping into all of Indiana's open records laws requirements and open meetings and all this other kind of stuff. And so when Mitch Daniels became governor, maybe 20 years ago now, his answer was to spin off this quasi-governmental corporation and get it out from underneath most of the transparency that state agencies would have to operate under. And the idea was it could be more nimble and cut the deals and be more business-like. But what we've seen is we end up with something like the LEAP district, which is kind of this really super expensive, half-baked situation where the IEDC pretty much became a land developer and an industrial park developer. And I think really just kind of lost their humility and went nuts. And now they've created a big mess because they don't have water. I mean, they didn't think it through. I mean, it's kind of ironic. The Republicans criticize government all the time as not being smart enough to do things like the private sector. And then the Republicans IEDC went out and did something that apparently wasn't as smart as the private sector. So I think that's kind of interesting. But so we'll have to see. I think there might be some hope for that opening up. And then the other thing too is that Senator Braun seems to be saying that the IEDC has been focused too much on central Indiana, which is where most of the growth is, the donut counties around Indianapolis. And so I think you're going to see him redirecting some of that economic development activity to try to get more in the rural areas. I mean, he's a southern Indiana person. He created his business in down in Jasper. So I think that's another change you might see is that the economic development efforts might be a little more evenly spread across the state.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Okay, so again, we don't have any questions in the queue, so you're going to get another lead question. We would like to know, this is going into some voting issues. What should we expect with the implementation of proof of citizenship to vote starting in July 2025? And I think the first one to answer this is to be Matt.
Well, I think we'll just see the same thing we've seen with all of these new hurdles to voting that have been created over the past decade or so, and they seem to be accelerating. You know, they kind of start with a false premise, right? So they'll say there's like election fraud, all these illegal people are voting, stuff that just simply is not true. Now, no election is perfect. I'm sure there's a small 0.0001% of people who probably aren't voting in the right place, technically aren't following the laws, and we should do what we can to prevent that. But starting with voter ID, 20 years ago, whenever the heck that was, 2005, I think, it starts out with the premise like, oh, we have all these people impersonating other people to vote in person. And so the only way we can stop all this horrible voter fraud of people showing up at a poll and pretending to be someone else is to require ID. Right. And your average person said like, well, I got an ID in my pocket. I need a license to drive my car. So, yeah, what's the big deal with that? That sounds like a reasonable thing. But then what we saw was that, the unhoused people often don't have the ID that they need. A lot of senior citizens eventually don't renew their driver's license, and then they don't have, the official government photo ID. You hear stories about people have to get their original birth certificate in order to get even a free state ID. So then you got to pay money, maybe $20 to whoever the health department is, where the heck you were born in the universe, and get all this documentation together. And what happens is people just get frustrated and they give up and they don't vote. And so you've created all these hurdles to make it harder to get registered and to be able to vote. And they're chasing ghosts. There is not rampant voter fraud in our system. And I just think it's curious to me that, from the last presidential election in 2020 up through 24, all you heard about was how horrible the fraud was, how everything was a steal, how everything was horrible, all this cheating. The minute Donald Trump is declared the winner of this 24 election, silence, total silence. You don't hear anybody talking about voter fraud anymore. So I find that kind of curious.
I think it's rather telling. Shelley, would you like to address that question?
Yes, Ball State just released a survey. I don't know if they do a survey every year. And I wanted to pull this up because they asked about this question. And I wanted to, you can find this on, I'll tell you where you can find it in just a second, the reactions. Okay. The question was, in their poll, over the last couple of elections, how confident are you that people who are legally qualified to vote are able to cast a ballot? Very confident was 48% that people who are legally qualified casted a ballot. Somewhat confident, 40%. So it's interesting, 88% of Hoosiers think that people who are legally qualified to vote are casting ballots. It's such a small amount of people who think there is something suspect about our elections and fraud. And yet we hear this from the legislature. We spend hours on this conversation when we are in session. So that is telling. And then this one is another way of looking at it. And they asked the question in a different way. And it said, over the last couple of elections, how confident are you that people who are not legally qualified to vote are voting and are prevented from voting? So people who are not able to vote, how confident are you that they are prevented from voting? So very confident. It's a little lower. It's 31%, and 70% of people feel that we've got enough guardrails in place that these individuals aren't voting, but it is less than the other. So it is interesting that it's how you come at this argument that it does decrease people's confidence. And you see this in the legislature. It is to Matt's point, when you are talking about this, that people are voting who do not have a right to vote, then it does create this narrative. And we see it. This poll reflects that there are those people that if you think that people who aren't legally able to vote are voting and are not prevented from voting, then it's impacting our elections. But at the same time, these same individuals, if you say, do you feel people who are legally able to vote, are they able to vote? There is a greater confidence there. So the narrative, the spin, I'm going to call it a culture war in elections, it does have an impact. It has an impact on people's trusting our elections, when at the end of the day, there is some confidence there in our election system. So I don't know if that's going to be a focus in 2025. I doubt it, but I don't know. Your question though was about this legislation that is going to take effect. I feel like the practice of it took place this year, and it did create some questions. I did a lot of canvassing, and we were able to make sure people knew what they needed to take with them into the when they did go to the poll to vote. And working the polls that day, I think that at the end of the day, people left frustrated. They are legally able to vote, but they didn't know where to go. It was just confusing. So they're able to vote, they're legally able to vote, but then they go because they think that they know where they can vote, and that has changed. And that was frustrating for people. So we can do a lot to make the process easier, but we are not doing that. Instead, we are, stoking the fire of these false narratives that our elections should not be trusted. And that's what's frustrating when you hear these conversations of making these big problems exist that don't exist. And as we can see through this poll, don't even exist in the minds of Hoosiers. So that's my answer. And at the end of the day, we can absolutely do better.
Thank you both for your answers to that question. This one is also, oh, excuse me, I do have someone in the queue. Tammy Smith would like to ask a question. So Tammy, I would ask you to unmute and direct your question first to Shelley.
I got in, it's specifically about something that Matt had said in opening statement, but Shelley, I think you can probably address this as well. Matt, in your opening statement, you mentioned, and I'm not going to get the lingo right, so bear with me, that there was that at the opening session, there was a statement about the new governor coming in, and you were questioning whether this legislative session would kind of follow more the Governor-elect Braun's agenda, or if there was some other agenda, like some other legislative agenda. Could you talk a little bit more to that statement?
Okay, I will do my best at answering that. And
yeah, first
Tammy,
we're directing it first to Shelley, and then Matt will answer. Thank you.
Tammy, I'll give an answer. I'm not sure I know exactly where you're coming from, but sort of what I hear you saying is whose agenda is going to be a priority in this next legislative session? Well, I will tell you this, and I appreciate this very much from the Senate majority, which would be Republicans. They established the Senate rules, and they've been working overtime to make sure that the lieutenant governor, who is the president of the Senate, doesn't get to take over the conversation, the agenda, to use the word and to get to the heart of the question. Because as president of the Senate, the lieutenant governor does preside, but the lieutenant governor does not get a vote unless there is a tie. And what wasn't clear in the rules is whether or not the lieutenant governor could make comment, could take the floor and begin to, put his finger, weigh in on issues that we're debating. So they had to clear that up. They did not want that happening. There was an issue with the parliamentarian, who is typically an employee of the lieutenant governor as president of the Senate, and that was actually reorganized as who is going to be the parliamentarian, who is that individual going to be answering to. And so that has shifted to the Senate and not the lieutenant governor's office. So there has been a real desire to protect the work of the Senate. So it is the agenda will have will be protected by the majority of the Senate, who gets to decide. So on the Senate side, they've put some guardrails in place to make sure that at least the majority of the Senate gets to have a greater say in the agenda and the direction that we go. I will say that there is a real concern about the new governor, but there was concern about the outgoing governor. I mean, at some points through COVID and other issues, when we had addressed the trans youth participating in youth sports, there were times when the Senate Dems were more in line with the governor, the Republican governor, than what their own party. So the agenda for the Senate will be determined by the Senate majority, the Republicans in the Senate. And as a Democrat, I'll be working hard to bring some balance there. But I'm sure that they're in conversation with the governor. I mean, it's their job, and they will be. But I know that they've been, in my 4 years there, it's been the agenda of the Republicans in the Senate that we've followed. And I don't suspect that will be much different.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Matt, would you care to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, to kind of clarify what I was referring to. So a tradition that has developed goes back to Speaker Bosma, where the House Republican majority on organization day, after the speaker is officially sworn in and is the speaker, he usually makes this speech in which he lays out the agenda of the majority party for the upcoming session. And along with that is this tradition of the first 10 bills being introduced, like 1001 through 1010, being these like official agenda bills. And so what the signal there is that the leadership is going to do everything it can to get those first 10 bills to become law. And what's happened now in this last organization day is the speaker essentially said, it's going to be a little unusual because I'm not really going to lay out an agenda. Although he mentioned a few vague things about energy, cost of energy, and some other things. But he made an allusion to the fact that we have a new governor coming in. So it might be that in the House, they're a little willing to kind of decide what they want to work from on this governor's shopping list of things. Now, I think another thing that's happening too as well is I've kind of described the House majority as like the tech billionaire who's launched himself into space and he has nothing else left on his bucket list. Because if you think about it, the Republicans have had total absolute control for, about 14 years now, I guess. And they have, maxed out the vouchers pretty much as far as you can go. They've got a little bit, more they could do around the margins there. They have kind of gone, they've marginalized organized labor as much as they can, teachers. I mean, they've kind of done everything they want to do. And quite honestly, I think they're out of steam. I think they're out of ideas. And so I think what they're waiting to see is like, okay, what on the governor's shopping list, on his wish list, do we want to kind of grab and maybe kind of take as our own and work with it? And then you have other situations where you have individual members who are able to introduce bills in the majority and get hearings to them, and they start to move. And so you can have some very consequential and controversial bills begin to move forward that I don't think were on anybody's specific agenda. So, for example, last session, Senate Bill 202, which messes with the tenure of professors and requires that everybody have intellectual diversity, and it really meddles in the operation of universities. That wasn't on an official list, at least in the House. I don't know, it might have been on a Senate list, but I think that was a bill that just kind of got moved out of the Senate and they kind of glommed onto it as something they really liked, and that it got passed. So you've got different pathways that things can end up on the agenda. But I think that for this year, the legislature, which is a little unusual because usually they don't care a whole lot about what the governor says. I mean, the governor can get things on the agenda, like let's better fund public health departments across the state and can make something happen there. But they don't really, just take their orders from the governor. So I think this time around, they might be a little bit more willing to take some things off of his list.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And Tammy, I hope that answered your questions. And we do have another individual in the queue at this time. I would call upon Adeline Rabbit to unmute and ask your question. It will be directed first to Matt Pierce.
Hey, thank you. I would just like to ask, are you aware of any environmental measures that the incoming governor is focused on? And also, either way, are there environmental or climate related issues that you are prioritizing supporting funding for this session? And also, is there sufficient support for these topics within the supermajority?
Well, again, I'm going to be pretty negative about this. The majority party, when they have dealt with environmental issues, it's been to the detriment. So they've wiped out most of the wetlands protections. They tried to make sure they legalized some versions of PFAS, which they claimed were like irreplaceable or something, which that's a forever chemical. That's a problem. And so there is no environmental agenda within the General Assembly where people are trying to think about how do we make our environment cleaner. In fact, to show you how little interest there is in the environment, we have interim study committees that meet mostly in the fall, but meet over the summer, but in between sessions that are supposed to study issues important to the state. And there is an environmental affairs study committee, and it has not been assigned a single topic for like a decade. So the translation to that is there's no environmental issue in the state of Indiana that the majority thinks is important enough to even talk about in between sessions, let alone pass some legislation on it. And so most of the time what they're doing is they're trying to protect the polluters from federal regulations as best they can, because a lot of times the states are given some leeway to implement federal legislation. And so I just don't have any hope that anything good is going to come out of that. And I know that we have people like Representative Bauer, Maureen Bauer from South Bend has been a real champion trying to get PFAS out of our environment and really address these other things. And we, Representative Boyd from Michigan City fought hard on the wetlands issue. And so we keep trying to get them focused on things like what to do about coal ash to make sure it's not invading our groundwater. And there's just not the interest there. So I don't know what's going to come of it. I'm just trying to make a quick pass here through the the governor's plan to see if he has anything to say about the environment, but nothing is jumping out here at the moment. So we'll just have to wait and see what exactly happens here.
Okay, Matt, thank you for that input. Shelley, we direct that question to you.
I will add that it's frustrating because I know that Senator Braun, now Governor-elect Braun, he was responsive when it came federally to responding to issues of climate. He was one of the sponsors of a climate bill. He's actually been good to work with in terms of designated wild areas at a federal level, but yet running for governor, it's been complete crickets. And that is frustrating because he could actually have a legacy that is consistent with what he was doing federally, but we'll have to wait and see. All of a sudden, states' rights, we're not going to do anything, and we could do so much. What Matt was saying about the lack of activity of what we've seen in our environmental committee, it's especially on the Senate side. I mean, it just seems that that my time has been focused on just fighting bad legislation and lifting up, rolling back protections for Hoosiers. And that is good work, but we hardly ever met. And when we did, it was really to roll back, to redefine PFAS or to lower standards for industry. And I really wanted to have my time spent in doing all that we can to protect and improve our environment. And so I have worked hard I'm now on agriculture and natural resources, because there is a great deal of good work that we could do in protecting our soil, regenerative farming, and protecting our wild spaces, protecting our current farmland, to protect our wetlands and what we have left. And so I'm going to try to come at this from a different vantage point, because I do have I have relationships established in those committees, and I'm hoping that we can continue to do good work, but coming at the problem from a different angle, because I was kind of felt like I was just hitting my head against a wall serving on environmental affairs. So I'll have to see if I can make any progress in in ag and in natural resources, but I'm hopeful that we can make some productive and positive steps forward in those spaces.
Okay, thank you very much, Shelley. We don't have anyone else in the queue, so I will go back to some of the questions that the leagues have put together. Are there any plans to increase voter security / voter suppression in the works, as far as you know? And I believe, Shelley, we go to you first with that question.
I don't hear anything. I'm not aware of anything. I will give it to the current chair of elections on the Senate side. He's he's much more reasonable. He has been reluctant himself to hear some of those bills, but I'm not hearing that that's going to be a priority or a large part of the conversation in 2025.
Okay. Matt, how about in the House?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything on those typical kind of voter suppression provisions in the name of, ballot integrity or something. So, I wouldn't be surprised if something pops up. But it is interesting because I think the fact that incoming President Trump won the majority vote as well as the Electoral College, I think that's taken a lot of the wind out of the sails of kind of the conspiracy people. I think that, if the Democratic candidate had won narrowly in a certain way in these swing states, then I think people would be all upset. So I think that maybe they're going to move on to the next thing. The one election thing that the governor has on his agenda is he wants to make it harder for things like school referendums to actually pass. And so he says he wants to make sure they can only be held in general elections, an even number of years, basically, when theoretically you'll have greater voter turnout. He's got language in there talking about misleading language describing the referendums, just kind of ironic because the language that is in there now is required by a Republican bill passed into law. So I guess he doesn't like his own party's language. So I think that probably when it comes to things related to elections, I think the focus might well be on how voter referendums to have like special assessments for schools, I think might be a big topic of discussion, and just exactly how those referendums have to be run.
And of course, not expanding referendums at all to other issues that voters
right.
might
No citizen initiative referendums has been mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that voter protection should be improved? And the context for this is protection from election worker errors and voter site security. And we have had discussions, and there have been some articles we've been reading about so many voters being disenfranchised because the clerk will not have initialed properly absentee ballots or early voting ballots. And we had over 100 here in Brown County, which doesn't seem that significant, but it is if you're one of those voters who thought their ballot was going to be counted. So do you know of any efforts that might be made to address those types of errors on the part of the election poll workers and clerks? And that question goes first to Matt.
Well, I'm not hopeful about that. I mean, it could be because I guess there is a pretty close election up in like the Boone County area, and they had a lot of situations where the both the initials were not on the ballot from the poll workers. And the thing that made that even worse, I think, is in some counties, they went ahead and counted the ballots. In other counties, they didn't count the ballots. So now you have kind of different standards. Now the courts have been very clear that, because the normal rule is if you can discern the intent of the voter, you should count the vote. The courts have said the one absolute clear exception to that is if these initials aren't on the ballot, you're not supposed to count it. Now, in 2007, I was back when the Democrats were in control of the House. I was chair of the elections committee, and I had legislation that would remove the requirement of the initials because I felt that it was really kind of outmoded. It kind of went back to, now we have these pre-printed magnetic scanning ballots and things. And I think the initialing went back to the days when it was just like regular paper that people used before voting machines even showed up. So I think that's a problem that should get addressed, because I do think a lot of times voters are getting disenfranchised because of mistakes made by election workers. And sometimes there are allegations that maybe one poll worker deliberately, knowing that it was the other party's ballot, kind of carefully forgot to put their initial on there. It's just some allegations of that. So I think that there are probably other ways to ensure the ballot is a ballot than requiring these initials. But again, the dynamic, at least in the House for the last decade, has not been about facilitating voting and making sure votes counts. It's been more about this narrative of we have people voting who shouldn't, we have votes getting counted that shouldn't be counted, and therefore we have to layer on all this additional bureaucracy to stop a problem that doesn't really exist. And then that's where you create more hurdles and more ways for people to get tripped up. And I don't see it going the other way at the moment.
Thank you, Matt. Shelley, how would you respond to that question?
I've heard nothing about elections other than the outcome of this last one. I don't anticipate this. I certainly would like to see it, as I said, standing outside of polling centers over this last cycle. It was clear that people who are able to vote felt that the hurdles were too high, that it was confusing, and we could do a better job in clearing out those hurdles for sure, and making sure that it's a little bit less ambiguous. But I just have not heard anything on elections from the elections committee, the members in my caucus, even that serve on elections. I've not heard concerns from them. I don't believe that there was a summer committee or interim committee meeting that met regarding elections concerns. So I'm sure that there will be bills filed, but I have not heard what the agenda is or what even my own members are thinking of filing in that space.
Okay. Thank you both for weighing in on that question. And it is about 10 minutes until our cutoff time. And I want to give each of you an opportunity to have give any closing remarks that you would like to have. And so, Shelley, if you would like to start with your closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you to the League of Women Voter members who are part of this. Really encourage all of our representatives and senators to participate, apply that pressure. First of all, because Matt and I love to do these with Matt, but I would really appreciate hearing from my colleagues that are on the other side of the aisle, the agenda, the priorities, what they're going to be working on, just to build relationships. So definitely continue to apply that pressure and make that request. So thank you for making these opportunities possible, because it means a lot to me. But I would say this. This week, I received a call from FSA.
1 second. Laura Black, yeah, you need to mute, please.
This week, I received a call from FSSA. that FSSA would be creating a wait list for our CCDF childcare waivers. And childcare is a serious problem in the state of Indiana. And this is only going to create a larger crisis in the state of Indiana. So what the FSSA is saying is they have realized this week that they don't have enough money to fill all the spots that are needed in the state of Indiana. So they're going to create a wait list for children, families who need access to childcare but cannot afford childcare, and they would receive a childcare waiver. We don't have enough. We have too many people who are receiving these waivers, and we're going to create a wait list. So that is a problem. But the greater problem is we currently have 73,000 children, families who receive a childcare waiver, assistance in accessing childcare. 73,000 families receive assistance to put their children in childcare. And FSSA is saying, oh my goodness, we're now realizing we need to cut that down to 45,000. And we need to cut that down before May, that's going to be the cliff. So from January 1 to May, we have to move 73,000 families who are receiving childcare access. We need to get that down to just 45,000 families. And how we're going to do that is every year there is a family who's receiving a childcare voucher has to be reauthorized as eligible to continue receiving that voucher. And as families roll off, and I'll come back to how families roll off in a second, then you would think they would fill those spots from the wait list, but they can't. They're not going to fill those spots because they have to whittle down that list to 45,000 families receiving a voucher. And how people roll off is they age out, they make too much money to receive a voucher, but the majority of them, they fail to fill out the paperwork. And so they, just by being an overwhelmed parent, they lose their voucher and they will not be able to renew. I asked FSSA, have they had any conversations with our employers, with families? Does anybody know? And they said no, that they've had no conversations. It's just at a crisis level and they're making this announcement. And I said, why are you making this announcement right now? You mean to tell me you are just now realizing at the time it was December 2nd. On December 2nd, you're now realizing that we have too many families receiving childcare vouchers and you need to almost cut that in half. You're just now realizing that. And he said, no, we discovered that we had this over budget a few weeks ago. And I said, I am concerned because it does seem like you are doing this in between administrations, because then nobody is going to have to take responsibility for it. The outgoing governor is outgoing, and there's going to be zero accountability there. The incoming one can just say, hey, this happened, it wasn't under my watch. And now this is one other crisis in FSSA, putting families pretty much just out to dry. I mean, families who rely on childcare help to receive the childcare that they need. So this is, I don't even know, they were supposed to, this is what's interesting. They were supposed, I was looped in because they know this is an issue that I have been fighting hard for. So they wanted to sort of let me down easy on Tuesday because the announcement was going to be made on Wednesday. The announcement was never made on Wednesday. They decided, they were told to wait until Friday. And so yesterday, this announcement was made. And I'll promise you, it's because of the news cycle. They knew on a Friday they could make this announcement and it would be quiet because the news cycle on the weekend is just different. There's less attention being made and it'll not get the attention that it needs. But I wanted to let you know that now we're going to have a childcare waiver wait list created in the state of Indiana. And we're going to cut those families who are currently receiving a voucher in half from January to May. And I don't know what the solution is to address that gap, but the childcare crisis we have in Indiana is going to get worse. Now, and thank you. On that good note, I can't wait to start the 2025 legislative session, which will be a budget session. So please come see me. And if you can't make it to Indianapolis, which I get, call me. I'll put my contact information in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Yeah, we can feel your pain through the screen here. Matt, would you like to give your concluding remarks?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting session. It's a little hard to predict how it's all going to roll because we do have a new governor coming in. There are going to be new agency heads. The governor is trying to reorganize the executive branch a bit. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the governor interacts with the legislature and how those agency heads interact with individual legislators who are on committees that impact their areas. And so that's going to be interesting to see. The other dynamic that will be interesting to see is, we have a lieutenant governor coming in who's really interested in fighting the culture wars. And I think that he seems to feel he's got an outsized role to play in the legislative process, even though lieutenant governors traditionally just preside and call on people and, kind of keep the trains running. So it's going to be interesting for me to see whether he attempts to kind of organize in both the House and Senate these more extreme members who really like fighting the cultural wars, whether he will kind of try to organize them into some kind of group within these caucuses and push them to offer amendments and things that address their issues, which are pretty extreme. So that's another thing to see. Well, you can tell, as Senator Yoder pointed out, at least in the Senate, they're trying to kind of marginalize the participation of this individual in the legislative process, but we'll have to see, how that all works out. And so that's going to be a different. I think the thing that will be the same is you can count on the minority party in both the House and the Senate. We take every opportunity we can get to make sure that alternative views are heard, that alternative ideas are put forth and voted on, is whenever we can avoid getting kind of taken out by the rules. The majority party is pretty good at sometimes using the rules to keep votes from happening or people getting on the record, but we'll continue to do that. And, when there are opportunities, when the Republicans have some positive policy proposals, some things that work, we will kind of join in. And, over the years, as I know that people often ask me, like, how can you keep going up there? It must be so frustrating when your bills can't get heard or get passed or whatever. But you can make some things, you can limit some damage, work at it, and you can occasionally make some good things work. And, sometimes they happen in ways you don't anticipate. And just, kind of one example of one issue is there was a bill a couple sessions ago that was kind of rewriting all the floodplain rules and was going to have a pretty big impact on how people got flood insurance and stuff. And we thought that it was really kind of not a very good policy. And it was interesting because the Democrats, we just like every time that bill in committee on the floor, we were just like saying, this is going to be a problem. You are really screwing up here, friends. You got to do better on this. And the interesting thing was, for a long time, we were just kind of ignored. And then suddenly, at the last minute, they kind of came to us and the bill got rewritten in a way that, it was reasonable. And so sometimes you can have an impact. And so we will keep working on that, and we won't give up, and we'll just see what kind of positive things we can make happen in what I consider to be a pretty challenging environment.
Well, I can't thank you enough for all that you do to make sure that voices are heard. Maybe voices that the majority doesn't always want to hear from, but we appreciate what you're doing on our behalf. We are anticipating hearing from you both again at our our other legislative updates that we have scheduled January 25th, February 15th, March 8th, and April 9th. And we will be following along with you on these issues and others that you are able to bring to our attention. I want to thank all of the participants that showed up today to listen to our very capable and esteemed representatives. And we thank you for the time that you take to answer the questions and the people here who are posing the questions. You can follow the work of this General Assembly at their website, and you will have a follow-up email with information from the co-sponsors and also alerting you to where you can get a video of this discussion today. We want to also thank CATS for doing the recording, and all of our team members and sponsors, the League from Monroe County, Brown County, and Johnson County, and the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce. So we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at our next meeting on January 25th at 9:30 a.m. Thank you, Matt and Shelley. Bye-bye.